For Hull, are there any? There are any statements?
Statements on the death of Michael.
Thank.
I'd like to speak on the condolence motion that was referred from the House for Michael Gordon. Gosh, I was just talking to the member for Macmillan. The irony of, if there can be irony about someone who was so beloved that passed last Saturday, is so rich, particularly when as I said to a journalist, on the day that this terrible tragedy occurred, and I was talking about the fact that there was a book which I borrowed. I think this is a book that was published in 1993, A Question of Leadership by Michael Gordon, about Paul Keating. And the opening chapter is about a guy called Dr. Chris Higgins, who is a former Treasury official. And it's an incredibly powerful opening chapter. It explains the mindset of the then Treasurer before he gave the very famous Press Club speech. And in the first chapter, in the first couple of pages, he talks about an incredibly well-loved Treasury official who was 47, who competed in an event and then collapsed and died of a heart attack. And it's hard to describe precisely how to put your feelings into words when this book had such a powerful impact on me in terms of deciding whether or not to pursue an active political career. And the fact that very first stanza talks about a beloved individual, and Keating was very moved by what had happened to Dr. Higgins and spoke, and I think that powered a lot of his reaction, and then the subsequent Press Club speech, the Placido Domingo speech. So it gives Michael's passing sort of additional context as well. As discussing it, it's like a chapter, for me personally, of your life closes. And that's how it felt when I got the news, sometime after Michael's tragic passing, about Michael, because he'd just been so part of the fabric of my political existence for such a long period of time. I didn't know him deeply well as a person, as the member for Macmillan does quite clearly, but I knew him as a profoundly ethical, moral, deep-thinking journalist, and someone who, when you thought about the reportage of the media and the direction that it takes, you would look at this guy and say, he's an example of what the best was in journalism. Michael really did represent journalism at its finest, in my view. He was independent, he was a critical thinker, he was a warm, I think that was powered by his personality, a warm, generous, decent human being. And you could have disagreements with him, but you knew at the end of those glasses, when you were having that conversation, when you were having a conversation about life or politics or the events of the day, there was a deeply thoughtful, profoundly intelligent human being and a good person, a really good human being. And I think for journalists that now live in the ebb and flow of the journalistic environment, they should reflect closely, particularly the current crop of journalists, about how Parliament and how parliamentarians have universally responded with grief about the loss of Michael. I think if some of them reflected, and this is no reflection on any journalist individually, on some of journalists now, I wonder what sort of reaction would be. And that's not to denigrate journalists that are here now, but Michael serves as a beacon, I think, for journalists. He serves as, I think, in the proudest traditions of journalism. And I think that in my dealings with him, and others will go and talk at far greater length than I about their dealings, you really knew that if the guy was at the end of the phone or sitting across from you, what you said was going to be held in confidence. And even if he disagreed with you, and often these discussions would happen, and you read the biography of Keating, Michael's not an uncritical assessor of the former Prime Minister and Treasurer. If you look, he breathed through the gift of how he used the English language. He breathed life into a story. You could really touch it. One of the great things I think about this book and the quality of his journalism was he breathed life, and often we're seen as, and can often be seen to be acting as caricatures, as cartoon characters, as silhouettes. What Michael did for me in terms of Paul Keating was breathe life into him. He just wasn't a saturnine figure. He was a living, breathing person. And if you look at the tributes, when he first wrote this book in 1993, his first iteration before Keating won the Prime Ministership in 93, you have people like Laurie Oakes and Neville Wran, Janine Haynes, who said, John Button, Michelle Grattan, singing his praises in terms of how he wrote about this book. I really do regret having to stand up here today because it's a reminder of the ephemeral, transitory nature of our lives. And also to remind us if there's people that we haven't spoke to. I saw that Michael had stepped aside and he retired from the Age, and it was always one of those things where he's a really interesting person to catch up with. I really would want to talk to him. He's one of those journalists that when you left, you wanted to talk to this guy. He had such depth and breadth as a human being. He was a real person, and the more that you learn about him in his passing, I was watching him on Facebook. I was a Facebook friend, the work he was doing in Africa. There was a living, breathing, decent human being that you wanted to catch up with and have a cup of coffee. And I hadn't had a chance to extend my commiserations from my perspective about his leaving, because I think the press galleries was the poorer for him retiring from the Age. But I never did. And it was always the going to. And in fact, you know, without making too much of a big deal, I thought that week before that, you know, you put it on your list of things to do. I'll give him a call. I should have chased him up. I wanted to say, you know, gee, I really missed him. When I explained to him a number of years ago, and I'm mindful of the time, sorry, Deputy Speaker, about the book and how influential it was very hard to get a copy. And so I chanced my arm. I said, you know, you wouldn't, by way of just joking about it, you wouldn't have a copy. For weeks he went searching for a copy he'd had in his archive. And then he turns up one day and says, I've got a copy for you. No big deal, no great fuss, just the man, his normal humble self. And he gave me the book that's a different iteration of this one, and he'd signed it to a true believer. I've still got that, and I posted that on the day that I found that Michael had passed. But it just the way he did it. Didn't have to do it. There wasn't anything in it for him, but it was just a mark of the man, the calibre of the person. Like I said, I mean, the phone call, the deepest regret that I think that I have is that you didn't have the chance to tell him what I thought about him as a journalist. And so I'm going to use the parliamentary record. Michael, you were an incredibly fine human being. You were the best of what journalists represented. I was incredibly sad to see that you had stepped away and stepped aside and retired. I was excited about the fact that you were going to have a new chapter of your life open, and I'm absolutely crushed that that hasn't happened, and I think we are all the worse for it. Thank you.
I thank the member of Holt for his contribution.